In this video, we'll focus on Chapter 2 of Carvalho's volume, Primer on Biblical Methods. In this chapter, she focuses on what's called the world of the text, sometimes known as the world within the text. Here we'll take a look at 5 elements: textual criticism, narrative criticism, rhetorical, reader response, and ideological criticism. Let's first consider textual criticism. Our objective here is to look at the written document itself and recover its earliest expressions. Two sorts of alterations can be observed in a text that has existed over time. Sometimes a copyist will introduce changes intentionally, changes that would add material or subtract material. When doing so, the goal here was to render something that was a little harder to understand more easily comprehensible. Unfortunately, sometimes when additional material is added or material subtracted for clarification, what's really going on is the copyist is not fully aware of what was meant by a supposedly opaque or difficult passage. The other kind of change can be accidental. For example, there are some letters in Hebrew that are fairly close in their shapes. The R and the D, the Resh and the Dalet. Notice up where the two lines intersect at right angle, one has a little tag that overlaps the vertical stroke. That's the Dalet. The Resh, the R letter, in contrast, has no overhanging tag. Consequently, these can be mistaken in the copying process and result in a different word. Haplography and ditography are two other sorts of mistakes that can happen in any kind of copying, whether it be Hebrew, whether it be ancient, whether it be modern, or in the case of haplography, consider the poem known as The Charge of the Light Brigade. It contains the expressions half a league, half a league, half a league onward, into the valley of death rode the 600. Notice that half a league is repeated 3 times. Imagine sitting there and copying this instead of including all 3 iterations of half a league, ending the first copying the first phrase, half a league, and then your eye, when it returns back to the exemplar text, that is the model from which you're copying, what if your eye landed on the word league in the 3rd iteration? And so you might only copy that phrase, half a league, once. That would be dropping something out, haplography. Ditography is the opposite, where absent-mindedly a person might write a word or a phrase twice. In contrast to textual criticism, the goal of narrative criticism is not to recover the most original, the earliest expressions within a text, but rather to take the text as we now have it, and especially focusing on where stories are related, historical events or other stories. What we're looking for now is how cleverly it was written. As our awareness of composition grows, we realize that a text, a story that is related, is not just a haphazard collection of memories, but there is intentional inclusion of elements and exclusion of other elements. This happens whenever you relate something that you saw or heard happen, or if you invent a story of fiction. You are choosing what to include or what to exclude. The same was going on in the case of biblical material. So, narrative criticism, focusing now on stories, history, as opposed to focusing on poetry, begins by observing, well, what exactly did the writer choose to retain? What was included? In contrast to what might have been included but was not. Of course, we don't know what was omitted, but we can just watch. Here's one obvious thing. For example, when a character is introduced, watch whether or not that character's name is disclosed. Here's a case where a name is not disclosed. In the account of the Syrian general Naaman, who contracts leprosy, he has a POW working for him, a slave girl that he's captured from Israel as part of the spoils of war. We never learn her name. She is a nameless figure. So this is a case where one element of information, namely the girl's name, was omitted. Now we might say perhaps it was forgotten. And that's possible as far as why was it omitted. Or perhaps the storyteller, the writer, is intentionally not giving the name so that she is portrayed as an insignificant, at least in the eyes of her master, she is an insignificant figure, when in reality, the cure that she proposes, that is, go to the Hebrew prophet and see if he will not secure God's help, the God of Israel's help, in miraculously curing her. Consequently, this nameless POW winds up being an individual of great significance in the curing of this foreign general. Consider also, when does the action of the story seem to pick up speed? You may be wondering, well, how do I know? It picks up speed when major events are told with very little detail so that you actually rush from one event to another within the larger spectrum of the story. The flip side is also worth watching for. When does the action of the story slow down? When story slows down, it's achieved by inserting more and more detail into a given episode or portion of the story so that as you read along, you're forced to slow down because there are more words, there's more description typically, or perhaps more dialogue included. One case of this is in Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac. As Abraham and Isaac and his servants arrive at Mount Moriah, we find that there is additional detail injected into the story so that we must slow down. And that's a significant place to slow the story because it's growing in its emotional intensity. Isaac is about to be sacrificed. We're not interested in simply displaying our skill of observation in these elements of narrative criticism. By observing them, they actually help us discover what the author wanted us to attend to. So we want to watch for added focus that results from these creative and artistic ways of choosing how the story will be retold. Next, consider what's called rhetorical criticism. The objective in rhetorical criticism, and this is an exceptionally, in my opinion, exceptionally useful skill to cultivate. The aim here is to watch for emphases within a connected passage, emphases that will contribute to the persuasive impact of this passage. It's particularly pertinent with non-narrative materials. So, poems, poetic material more broadly, including prophetic oracles. These are good places to practice the skill of observing rhetorical features. Here's how to go about it. First, you want to watch for the theme of a given passage. By passage, here we're not talking about a verse, but several connected verses that belong to a pericope, that belong together. We want to detect a theme. How to detect a theme? Simply by watching for observation of literal terms or the cultivation of a topic over several terms, several verses. We want to observe where this theme begins and where it ends. And here, as you know, we don't want to limit ourselves to the chapters as we have them in our modern Bibles. Rather, we want to study beyond and across chapter boundaries and see what materials actually cohere under a single theme. Let me suggest an example right now that you may be familiar with. In Matthew chapter 5, the chapter begins after a brief introduction, and Jesus then starts his teaching, as Matthew describes it, with what we've come to call the Beatitudes. Blessed are. First one is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. And then continue several more verses that begin with that same expression. So rapidly we see these belong together. Boundaries would be established by where do the blessed sayings begin and where do they end. And then we want to study the information that each verse within these boundaries contributes to that theme. After we've analyzed that, We're not talking about just extracting literal expressions, but thinking about what does it contribute. Paraphrasing is very helpful here. Then we want to ask a sequence question. We want to isolate the flow of thought. What we're asking here is there a logical development that the writer, the teacher, that Jesus is presenting to us? And along that way, it's very useful to ask, why is it in the given sequence? So, for example, why do the Beatitudes begin with blessed are the poor in spirit? Is there some reason that makes that a comprehensible or a predictable or a sensible place to begin, rather than taking the second Beatitude and fronting that to the beginning? We're not talking about us proposing to resequence. We never want to resequence it. We want to take it as is with the assumption that it's in the order in which we find it for a reason. Similarly, we want to ask, why is the last saying placed last? In the case of the Beatitudes, as you may recall, the last one switches incidentally from general, blessed is anyone, to blessed are you. It zeroes in. There is an intensification, as if Jesus is fingering or looking directly at his disciples and saying, now take this seriously. When the following happens to you, namely persecution, I want you to remember this. So there's an intensification. And so we want to ask, why would he do that with the topic of persecution? Why would that be a particularly suitable place to end this series? This is the kind of thinking that rhetorical criticism causes us to ponder. The impact of it can be immensely valuable for preaching a connected passage rather than just cherry picking, preaching or teaching on just an isolated verse out of context. Next, we want to consider what's come to be called reader response criticism. Reader response talks about how we as a modern reader in our existential moment of reading any text, biblical or otherwise, what's going on within us? What is this text that we're reading? What is it evoking from us? Highly existential. So what reader response critics depend on is the assumption that meaning, that is the text's own meaning, is generated afresh every time someone brings a text to life, that is by reading it. In contrast to this is the assumption that the greater value of a text is consistent, not changing with every individual reader in whatever is going on in their life at that moment, but rather there is a constant or reliable authorial intent embedded within any text, and that authorial intent will transmit a consistent meaning regardless of the existential surroundings of the reader. Sometimes it's called a performance of the reading, not necessarily dramatic, but that's the moment when the text is being read by any individual. I trust you can sense how different those two viewpoints and assumptions are, or emphases or valuations. Our author Carvalho, page 47 of the primer, offers this critique, which is worth noting. One of the liabilities of reader response criticism is that it has no way to judge one reading as better than another. If this is the case, then the text can mean anything. And if it can mean anything, then it really means nothing at all. Now let's turn to what's called ideological criticism. Ideological criticism. You may recognize this as related to something that we studied before, namely sociological criticism. With ideological criticism, there is this assumption. The assumption that within the text, and frankly behind the text, exist unexpressed ideologies. There are some priorities, some beliefs, there is an agenda that the writer is intending, according to the ideological critic, they assume the writer is intending to send a message, almost a coded message. It is not obvious, and that's on purpose. This is their understanding. So, what are some kinds of ideologies that ideological critics are watching for? class struggles, the poor rising up against the rich in order to get a fairer share of what is due them. So, with biblical criticism of an ideological sort, seen through Marxist lenses, the critic will look at a biblical story and ask, if the poor are present in a story, they're not present in every story, but if the poor are present, how are they represented? Or how are the powerful, the rich, represented? Poor and weak, the rich and powerful, how are they presented in a story? It could also be hold true for a teaching. And as they look at such a story, they will watch for any indications that the writer is, instead of presenting the poor as simply, shall we say, disposable, they will watch for indications that the poor are being lifted up. One of the aims of ideological criticism, then, is to watch for any paradoxical hints that would seek to restore what is fair, to rectify the disequilibrium of unfairly disadvantaged classes, genders, or races. There are other groups that can be included as well. So, for example, recall the earlier conversation about Naaman, the Syrian general, and his prisoner of war, a servant girl who was captured from Israel. We talked about the fact that she is not named, so that is treating her as an ostensibly insignificant figure. So she is a POW, she's female, she is, as a result of being in a POW, she's in a foreign country, so she is multiply disadvantaged in the social structure. Nevertheless, as we commented earlier, she is the one with a solution to the problem, which is just upside down for what you would expect. It's paradoxical. All right, now we're coming to the last sentence on the screen. These hints are termed subversive since they would upset the status quo. Status quo is Naaman's got the power and the servant girl is dispensable. She's insignificant in terms of the value system of that day. And yet, by virtue of the fact that she is the person with a solution, we see that the storyteller, the chronicler, the historian from Israel is saying, in God's economy, she is incredibly, incredibly important. In fact, Naaman's survival and health, she holds that in her hands. She could have withheld the information about the Israelite prophet who had the possibility of cure. Instead, she divulges that information. So she is, in a sense, we might say, the power broker of information in that story. All right. As far as it being paradoxical or subversive, it would be subversive because the story does not begin to say, it doesn't start out with this premise saying, God values little people, and we want you to see how, trace what happens with the small girl and how influential she is. Rather, the story just unfolds, and as we read it, we're thinking, well, Naaman is a mighty person, and he winds up on top at the end of the story. He winds up as a grateful recipient of God's grace. Now, the insights we've talked about regarding the significance, the power of this little girl is embedded within the story, but it's not obvious. That's what we mean by it being subversive. They're just hidden hints, and you have to, it's like a parable, isn't it? You have to meditate on it, and then the lights start to go on and say, oh my goodness, God's agenda and his power structure and value system is so different than the worldly system, which looks to a military leader as the figure with all the authority and power, and he's the in-control guy. And no, that's not the case. So ideological criticism, there are some perspectives from this and sensitivities that we can cultivate by virtue and thanks to ideological critics that can be exceptionally valuable. And at the same time, you'll pick up some sources that take an ideological lens and apply it to a passage, and you'll come away saying, man, I don't think that passage is saying that at all. I think they're reading something into the text. So be a judicious user of the whole concept of ideological criticism. Here then is what we've looked at in the world of or behind the text. We've looked at textual criticism with its efforts to recover the earliest form, the earliest wording, frankly, of the written text. We've looked at narrative criticism, which looks at the art of retelling stories or histories and deriving from that an increased sensitivity to what is the writer's objective, given what they include, what they exclude, where they accelerate, where they decelerate. There are other elements of narrative criticism as well. That's just a sampler. We've looked at rhetorical criticism, rhetorical in the sense of persuasive, especially applies to non-narrative material, poetry, including oracles, prophetic oracles, and elements of theme and boundaries and sequence of verses, and consequently deriving a stronger sense of the cohesive, sequential, persuasive impact of a passage. We've looked at reader response criticism, which is highly existential, saying that meaning happens when I as an individual, you as an individual, sit down and read a passage in the modern era. All that's going around in your world, in your mind, that's coloring how you're reading it, that's the meaning of the passage. We've talked about the problems with that. And finally, we've reviewed ideological criticism and the ways it can increase our sensitivities to paradoxical and subversive messages intended by the text, but also the caution that sometimes ideological criticism can import material to the text, import viewpoints or values that may not be native to the text itself.